At 4:47 in the morning on September 11, 1944, a 23-year-old kid from Macon, Georgia, stood in the pale yellow light of a maintenance hangar at Leiston Airfield in Suffolk, England, running his fingers along the riveted seams of a fighter plane that his squadron commander had already written off as scrap. His name was First Lieutenant Calvin "Patch" Mercer. He had 41 combat missions behind him. He had 3 confirmed kills, 2 probables, and a reputation among the men of the 357th Fighter Group as either the luckiest pilot in the 8th Air Force or the most reckless one, depending on who you asked. And tonight, the night before one of the most concentrated stretches of aerial killing in the entire European theater, he was out here alone in the dark, talking to a machine that nobody else believed in anymore. The P-51 Mustang he stood beside had no official name on its fuselage. The other pilots in the 362nd Fighter Squadron had started calling it the Quilt, and not as a compliment. Because over the previous 4 months, Mercer had brought that airplane back from missions in conditions that should have ended with a smoking crater in German soil, and every time the ground crews had patched the airframe with whatever metal they had available, the repairs had been done fast and functional rather than clean and cosmetic. There were sections of the left wing root covered in aluminum from a different variant entirely. There was a panel behind the cockpit that had come off a salvaged P-51B. The paintwork was mismatched in at least 6 places. The airplane looked, as Staff Sergeant Roy Pittman of the ground crew once put it, like somebody had lost a bet and then tried to fix it with whatever fell out of their pockets. The Merlin engine under that battered cowling, however, a Packard V1650-7 producing 1,590 horsepower at war emergency power, ran like a Swiss watch. Because Calvin Mercer understood something that the bureaucrats at group headquarters and the veteran flight leaders who smirked at his patched-together Mustang did not. He understood that what mattered in a fighter was not how it looked. What mattered was whether it would keep flying when everything around you was trying to kill you. And he had spent the better part of a year learning exactly what this particular airplane would and would not do. Mercer had grown up the son of a mechanic. His father, Earl Mercer, ran a small automobile repair shop on Poplar Street in Macon, and Calvin had been pulling engines apart and putting them back together since he was 9 years old. He had enrolled at Georgia Tech in 1939, intending to study mechanical engineering. Then December of 1941 happened, and like tens of thousands of young American men, he found a different application for these technical education. He had soloed in a Stearman PT-17 biplane in Southard Field in Americus, Georgia, in March of 1943. He had been good enough to be selected for pursuit training, and good enough at pursuit training to be assigned to the 357th, one of the premier fighter groups in the 8th Air Force, a unit that would eventually produce more aces than any other American fighter group in the European theater. What Mercer was not, at least in the eyes of his superiors, was polished. He asked too many questions. He modified procedures without asking permission. He had twice gotten into shouting matches with his flight leader, a captain whose name we will leave out of this story out of fairness to his descendants, over the proper way to execute a bounce from the 6 o'clock high position. That captain had grounded Mercer for 4 days in July and had filed a report recommending that he be transferred to a less demanding assignment. The report had gotten lost somewhere in the administrative machinery of the 8th Air Force, and Mercer had stayed. He had also, during those same months, been doing something that nobody had officially authorized him to do. Working with Sergeant Pittman and 2 other enlisted men during their off hours, Mercer had been making incremental adjustments to the trim of his aircraft, to the tension on the ailerons, to the mixture settings on the carburetor. Nothing that violated regulations in a way that could be easily identified, just small refinements accumulated over dozens of hours of careful work that had made his particular P-51 fractionally more responsive at high altitude, fractionally quicker in the roll, fractionally more fuel efficient at the cruise settings he used on long escort missions. He had also spent more hours than he could count studying the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109, reading captured technical documents, interviewing returned POWs through a contact he had made in air intelligence, building in his head a three-dimensional understanding of what those airplanes could and could not do. By September of 1944, he knew, for example, that a standard FW-190A8 with a BMW 801D2 engine had a roll rate advantage over the P-51D below 20,000 feet, but that the Mustang could sustain a tighter horizontal turn at altitudes above 25,000 feet. He knew that the 109 G10 had a superior zoom climb, but bled energy dramatically in a sustained vertical fight. He knew these things the way his father had known the particular knock of a worn crankshaft bearing, not from a book, from feel and experience and obsessive attention. None of this had impressed his superiors. The patched airplane was an embarrassment. The unauthorized modifications were a liability. The arguments with his flight leader were a disciplinary problem. On the evening of September 10, 1944, Calvin Mercer had been officially informed that he was being reassigned to a training slot, effective in 2 weeks. His combat flying was essentially over. He stood in the hangar that night, hand on the cowling of his airplane, and he made a decision. Now, September 11, 1944. The mission briefing begins at 0530 hours. The 357th Fighter Group is assigned to escort B-17 Flying Fortresses of the 1st Bombardment Division on a strike against synthetic oil production facilities at Mersburg, Germany. This is not a routine mission. Mersburg is one of the most heavily defended targets in the entire Reich. The Germans understand what the Allied bombing of synthetic oil means to their war effort. The Luftwaffe defends it accordingly. The weather over East Anglia is a gray ceiling at 800 feet, with broken cloud layers stacking up through 18,000 feet. The briefing officer describes expected fighter opposition as moderate to heavy. He uses the word moderate. The pilots in the room, the ones who have been to Mersburg before, do not visibly react. They know what moderate means over Mersburg. Mercer's P-51D carries 269 gallons of fuel, 184 in the internal tanks and 85 in a drop tank mounted on the center line. He is carrying 1,840 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition distributed across 6 M2 Browning machine guns, 400 rounds per inboard gun and 270 rounds per outboard gun. The airplane weighs 10,100 pounds at takeoff. The round trip to Mersburg and back is approximately 900 miles. There is almost no margin. They are over the Dutch coast at 25,000 feet when the contrails start. The Luftwaffe response to the Mersburg raid on September 11, 1944, is not moderate. Elements of Jagdgeschwader 300 and Jagdgeschwader 301, the specialized bomber-destroyer units that the Germans called Sturmgruppen, have been scrambled in force. These are not inexperienced pilots thrown up in desperation. These are professionals flying heavily armored FW-190A8 variants modified specifically to attacking heavy bomber formations, escorted by standard 109s flying top cover. The men leading these formations collectively have hundreds of aerial victories. They know exactly what they are doing. The first attack comes in from the 11 o'clock high position at 0941 hours. Mercer sees it before his flight leader does. He calls it on the radio. He does not wait for an acknowledgement. He pushes the throttle forward to the war emergency power stop, feels the Merlin dig in with 1,590 horsepower, and pulls the Mustang into a climbing turn toward the incoming Focke-Wulfs. He is violating the escort doctrine. He is supposed to stay with the bombers. He does it anyway because he has done the geometry in his head, and he understands that if those FW-190s reach the bomber stream from that angle, they will kill B-17s before anyone can stop them. He engages the lead Focke-Wulf at a closing speed somewhere above 700 miles per hour combined. The German pilot is good. He brakes hard left, expecting the American to overshoot. Mercer has anticipated the brake. He has been in this exact geometry before, in his head, hundreds of times. He cuts inside the turn, the airframe buffeting at the edge of a high-speed stall, the G-forces pressing him down into the seat with what feels like the weight of 3 men sitting on his chest, and he fires a 2-second burst from 200 yards. The FW-190 comes apart at the wing root. This is the first kill of what historians would later describe as one of the most extraordinary 72 hours of aerial combat in the history of American fighter aviation. Here is something that the YouTube algorithm does not capture, and that no highlight reel can convey: what it actually feels like inside a P-51 cockpit in a turning fight at 25,000 feet. The cockpit smells of hydraulic fluid and oxygen and sweat. The noise is constant: the engine, the slipstream, the rattle of the airframe under G-load, and occasionally, when you are close enough to another airplane, the sound of its engine passing through your canopy like a scream. Your vision narrows under G-forces. Your hands are operating the controls partly through training and partly through something beyond training, some kinesthetic knowledge that your body has built up through thousands of hours of repetition. You are making decisions in fractions of seconds that you could not explain afterward if you tried. Mercer would fight 3 separate engagements on September 11th. He would be separated from his flight after the first engagement and would spend the next 40 minutes flying alone in a target area defended by some of the most capable fighter pilots in the world. He would engage and destroy a second FW-190 over the initial point at 10:03 hours. He would take cannon fire through the left wing, adding another patch to the Quilt, and would limp back to Leiston with 23 gallons of fuel remaining, landing with his hands shaking so badly that Sergeant Pittman had to help him with the canopy latch. He had 2 confirmed kills on September 11th. On the morning of September 12th, he should not have been flying. The wing damage from the previous day had not been fully assessed, but the 357th was again tasked against oil targets, and Mercer, who had slept 4 hours and eaten a plate of powdered eggs, was in the briefing room with everyone else. His commanding officer looked at him across the room and said nothing. Sometimes institutions make their decisions through silence. The September 12th mission produces the single engagement that becomes the centerpiece of every account of Mercer's 3 days. At approximately 11:15 hours, at 27,000 feet over central Germany, he finds himself alone, again separated from his flight in the chaos of a large-scale engagement, against 3 Messerschmitt 109 G-10s, whose pilots have clearly identified him as isolated and are working together to box him in. This is textbook German fighter doctrine. One 109 forces him forward, one cuts off his dive escape route, and the third sits at his 6 o'clock, waiting for the geometry to close. These are not rookies. The man at Mercer's 6 o'clock is flying with the kind of patient, metronomic precision that marks someone who has done this many times before. He is not rushing, he is herding. Mercer has 340 rounds remaining in his outboard guns and 180 in his inboard guns. He has 51 gallons of fuel. He is 340 miles from home over enemy territory with a damaged left wing. What he does next, and there is a report in the archives of the 8th Air Force at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama, that describes this in the dry language of an official after-action assessment, is to execute a maneuver that has no name in any training manual. He pulls his Mustang into a vertical climb at war emergency power, sustains it past the point where the airspeed indicator is dropping toward a number that should mean a departure from controlled flight, and then at the top of the zoom, As the airplane shudders on the edge of a hammerhead stall, he applies full right rudder and aileron in a combination that snaps the Mustang through a rotation that the three German pilots, who have been flying by the book, do not expect and cannot immediately counter. He comes out of it pointing at the 109 that had been at his 6 o'clock, now suddenly ahead of him and below, and he fires his last long burst from 150 yards. That pilot's name, Mercer would learn decades later through research conducted by a German aviation historian, was Hauptmann Werner Schultz. Schultz had 27 aerial victories. He had been flying combat since 1940. He was 26 years old. He had a wife in Stuttgart and a son he had seen twice. Mercer destroyed 2 more 109s on September 12th. He reached Leiston with 11 gallons of fuel and landed on a runway made slippery by an afternoon rain. He did not file an after-action report until the following morning because when he climbed out of the cockpit, his legs would not hold him, and he sat down on the hard stand and stayed there for a long time. The third day, September 13th, produced 2 more victories in a single engagement northeast of Dummer Lake. His total for the 72-hour period was 9 confirmed aerial victories, all of them against experienced Luftwaffe pilots, most of them in circumstances where the tactical advantage had started with the Germans. The recommendation for the Medal of Honor that his crew chief informally raised with the squadron intelligence officer was quietly redirected into a Distinguished Flying Cross recommendation, in part because of the unauthorized modifications, in part because of the disciplinary record, and in part because institutional machinery has never been comfortable with people who do things in ways that were not in the manual. The DFC was awarded 3 months later in a brief ceremony that Mercer's commanding officer did not attend. He was transferred to a training assignment in England the following week as originally scheduled. He flew no more combat missions. Calvin Mercer went home to Macon, Georgia in the spring of 1945. He went back to work in his father's shop on Poplar Street. He did not talk about the 3 days over Germany for almost 30 years. In 1973, a researcher from the Air Force Historical Research Agency contacted him while compiling records for what would become a comprehensive study of American fighter ace performance in the European theater. Mercer sat down with the researcher for 2 days and walked him through every engagement in precise technical detail: the geometry, the fuel states, the ammunition counts, the exact moments of decision. The researcher later said it was the most complete and accurate combat testimony he had ever taken from any pilot of any nation. The patched airplane, officially serial number 44-14733, was scrapped in 1946. What Calvin Mercer proved in those 3 days, in that battered, mocked, mismatched Mustang over the burning oil fields of central Germany, was something that institutions always resist knowing: that the most dangerous in a fighter is not the airplane, it is the mind of the man who understands it completely. 9 of the Luftwaffe's best found that out, one at a time, and did not live to report it. If you had a grandfather or great-uncle who flew with the 8th Air Force, or if you have ever stood in a museum beside a P-51 and wondered what it actually felt like inside that cockpit, tell us about it in the comments. These stories belong to all of us, and the more we share them, the longer they survive.